A4 Nation. Thanks to everybody that's pulling this together. I can't tell you what a great day this has been for all of us, and it's really exciting to wrap up this Warfighter Focus Day with 3 of 8 of our MAJCOM Directors of Logistics, Engineering, and Force Protection. And since that's the world's longest duty title, from here on out, they're going to be A4s.
Right.
And as MAJCOM A4s, and in particular, these 3 are lead MAJCOM A4s, they're collectively responsible for over 30 of our major weapon systems and for the professional development, training, resourcing, policy for over 80,000 airmen that fall under the A4 umbrella. So let me quickly introduce them. Hailing from South Carolina and recruited to ride the pine, play basketball at the United States Air Force Academy. Major General Select Kenyon Bell has had a distinguished career in aircraft maintenance, having commanded the squadron, group, and wing level. He's now serving as the Global Strike Command's A4, and I have a fun fact. Kenyon is married to a former LRO. And he had to do that to cheat so that he could make sure he had the fuel at the first of the morning, first AMU to have the fuel at the first fighter wing at Langley Air Force Base.
Anything for the mission.
Anything. And an NCAA all-star rugby player at the United States Air Force Academy, Brigadier General Hammerstedt, has also had a distinguished career in maintenance, commanded at squadron, group, and wing level, and in depot, and is now serving as Air Combat Command's A4. She is also, a fun fact, drove for almost 15 years a white up-armored Humvee around base, which she has just recently traded in for a lifted Ford 150 Raptor.
Sorry.
Another fun fact about Hammer, she and I suffer from the same affliction of having married a fighter pilot. And hailing from Atlanta, Georgia,
Cool.
another Southern boy, and a graduate of Georgia State University, and someone who recently challenged and defeated General Minahan in an all-or-nothing arm wrestling competition. Major General Dave Sanford has also had an exceptional career as a logistics readiness officer, commanding at the squadron, group, and wing level, and also commanding DLA Aviation. He's currently serving as Air Mobility Command's Director of Logistics, Engineering, and Force Protection. And a fun fact, he has been married, has known his wife since he was 8 years old. And as he said, there's 2 separate family trees. So let's get started. We have a few panel questions to go through today, but we'll save a little bit of time at the end for questions from the audience as long as Dave Sanford does not have the mic last. So, A4s. Each MAJCOM is getting after accelerate, change, or lose with their own priorities. Could you describe one line of effort being executed through your A4 staff that gets after a MAJCOM priority? And how does that effort directly affect an LRS, missile maintenance group, aerial port squadron? General Bell, I'll start with you in Global Strike.
Okay, thanks, General Hoffman. First, the lights are blinding, so I assume that there are people out there because there were chuckles that were happening a minute ago. So within Global Strike Command, as far as accelerate, change, or lose, the unique concept that we have is that we are 24/7 task forces for STRATCOM. So across the ICBM portfolio, as well as across the bomber portfolio, availability of assets is a huge issue, particularly aircraft availability. So one of the lines of effort that we are working through is predictive analysis, making sure that we are looking forward as far as what is coming next. I know we all are dealing with legacy aircraft. Legacy aircraft has a unique concept when you start to talk about an aircraft that you're going to fly for 100 years. And with that, we want to know what is the next item that is going to impact us. So our CAN rates are skyrocketing. So we are trying to get after predictive analysis. One of the unique things that we're doing is, and there was a breakout session today, CBM Plus with Operation Trailblazer. I won't rehash that because there were several people who were in the room, but how we go about predicting what is next and making sure that we can improve aircraft availability to have our forces ready at any time for STRATCOM taskings.
Yeah, thanks. General Sanford, what about AMC?
So I had the pleasure of following my boss, kind of, about 6 hours later. So for those who heard his speech, he's focused on C2, survivability, navigation. So our, as a MAJCOM, our AOR is a little different. It's the globe. And so we're very much focused on set the theater, because we think that's how we'll get after his priorities. So not so much an LRS. Where we're trying to transform is our en route system, so the air mobility squadrons. And so increasing the spares availability, trying to use not predictive analytics necessarily on the aircraft, but to try to determine what our wartime consumption rates will be, and then position those parts at our AMSs, expanding that to include 135s, C-130s, support equipment, et cetera, and then using that in an operational rotation. So that's one of our primary focus, along with like current ops and how to maintain our existing airframes. But again, set the theater is the main piece to get after his priorities.
Yeah, thanks. General Hammerstedt, ACC?
So first off, do we get to say a fun fact about you? Because I'm going to think about that as I'm sitting up here. Thanks for having us. So I think you might hear a common theme throughout the panel, but for us at ACC, dealing similar to Global Strike and really AMC, it's our legacy platforms consumes a tremendous amount of our time. And it's funny, and most of you know this because you're living it, but we are actually, divesting, sustaining, and modernizing our fleets all at the same time. And when I say our fleets, I mean within the same fleet, doing all three of those things at the same time. So if you think about the F-16 or the AWACS, or, we are going to be sending aircraft to the boneyard while we're modernizing them and trying to sustain them at the same time in real world operations. So it's something that we've not done to this level, at least in my career. So tremendous challenges. Getting to the point of the biggest line of effort is really how do we get after aircraft availability. And if you look across all of our fleets, really in the Air Force, we're hovering between 50 and 60%. And if I could see in the audience, I would assume those of you that are on a flight line today would probably be nodding your heads, because it's manifesting in our daily operations in terms of trying to meet the flying hour program and build the readiness that we need to deploy. So that's really the biggest thing. And to get after that, we've been kind of picking apart what goes into AA, whether it's your S rate, your M rate, and then your depot possessed, and what are the things that we can do to get after each of those levers to try to increase AA, even if it's by the eaches of aircraft. And we've had to manage that more so than at any other point in time in my career. So that's probably the biggest thing feeding into readiness in ACC.
Yeah, great. So Jen, while we've got you, among the many requirements that an ACE scheme of maneuver dictates for our strike packages is disaggregated ops. Smaller sortie generation packages operating somewhat independently. Can you speak to what you see as the operational and leadership challenges for logistics maintainer, majors, captains, senior NCOs leading in that environment, and what does mission command mean for them?
Okay, well, that's a lot. Okay, so I think the biggest thing in terms of ACE and being the force provider is newsflash for everyone. We don't have enough resources necessarily to do ACE, right? So when you think, I just talked about aircraft availability, but if you think about support equipment, which I know there's in General von Hoffman's team really working hard to get after that, but it's also airmen, people. So if you think about taking 20 years ago, we would deploy a squadron to a particular AOR, but now we're talking about dividing that unit possibly into 3 or 4 different locations. So how do we resource that? So I think the challenge for leaders is going to be kind of what General Minahan talked about today. It's all about risk and how do you manage that risk. You are going to have to take risk, right? So where are you going to put your 7-level avionics troops? Where are you going to put the one tester that you have? How are you going to get about doing that? And as General Minahan so eloquently said, we're not saying be reckless. It's about understanding what it is you need and thinking through where you're going to have to take that risk. And really playing into that is, I think, the second part of your question, which is about Mission Command.
Yeah.
For those of you in the audience that have not read Air Force Doctrine Pub 1, it's really, really good, and it's really short and really easy. Even I can read it and understand it completely about Mission Command, but it really is going to be the deal breaker going forward in the future fight. And my only comment there on Mission Command is that we're going to have to do it. We're going to be separated from our traditional chains of command in terms of how we execute aircraft maintenance. So we have to think about how we're going to clear impoundments. And somebody made a comment last week at a particular wing in Air Combat Command. It's the wing commander that has the only authority to add airplanes to the weekly flying schedule. I mean, that's a simple example, but we're not going to win if our decisions like that are at those kinds of levels. So you have to think about the things that we're doing today. And my recommendation to those of you in the audience is practice while we have time to practice. Practice when nobody's shooting at you. Practice when we have time to fail, so that we're comfortable with delegating things in a peacetime environment. So pay attention to what's coming across your desk and ask yourself if you absolutely are the person that has to make this decision, or can you push it down? And practice what it feels like to let someone else clear that aircraft impoundment that may not necessarily have the authority, but do it the right way while we have time to think through those things.
Yeah, thank you. So Kenyon and Dave, the next question for you. Most of the time when people think ACE and that scheme of maneuver, the first thing that pops into their mind is operating within the first island chain, so strike ops. But I assume you have a much different view and a much different perspective on what that is. Can you talk to what, I'll start with you, Kenyon, what AMC is doing for scheme of maneuver, for exercising, what that looks like?
Yeah, so our command has challenged each of the wings to figure out how they're going to generate aircraft. There's an MCA piece to it, but I'll admit our focus on our MCA right now is making sure that the core individual knows their job and can maximize that capability. And then we're teaching them base defense type skills, life-saving skills, et cetera. So we have a couple of like schoolhouses, if you will, at some of our bases that are turning out people. So I think that's helped. It's not a manpower drill for us. We have, to your point, to make our packages lighter, we've actually tailored some of our UTCs down as much as 50%. That's why Set the Theater is so important for us, because we're banking on having the material forward so that we can actually come forward faster and then support the joint force or help distribute forces. And then, it's a key piece. I think for us, I say that as a prelude because it'll all culminate in Mobility Guardian 23 this July. And so the goal is to test all the concepts and experimentation that we've identified to see how far forward we can operate, how we can sustain ourselves, how long we can stay in the fight by doing power projection. And so I'll admit there's dozens of details that go into what we're trying to capture. It's probably I would consume the whole panel, but we'll see how it all works out in Mobility Guardian 23. And then I think the boss has a really brilliant initiative as far as after that in August we'll collect our lessons learned, but it won't be your traditional lessons learned. It's going to be a lessons learned that then drives what our POM position is going to be to help fill in those gaps and seams. So I thought that was brilliant. And so that's where we're headed. And so the concepts that do well, we'll push forward. Those that we need to relook at, retool, we'll test in further exercises.
Yeah, great, thanks. And Kenyon, what about for Global Strike?
Yeah, so within Global Strike, the ACE as a scheme of maneuver is absolutely where we're moving as well. Slightly different twist to it. Bomber Task Force, or BTFs, is the way that we move and operate as task forces. And combatant commander desires is quite large. But what we have been doing, similar to what General Sanford just talked about, is we have had the opportunity to go out on multiple BTFs now. And our BTFs, I should also mention, look different even within the command. So a BTF for our B2s, We really refer to it as a CONUS-to-CONUS mission, so they will leave from home station, go and accomplish their mission and come back. For the B-1s and the B-52s, they're leaving from home station, maybe taking a 2-4 ship somewhere, and then coming back home, but taking the packages that they have with them. So what we've been focusing in on is how do we decrease that footprint? And each time a BTF goes out, there's a triage that goes on with it where we're able to decrease the amount of equipment, items, and et cetera. And then, of course, there's experiential learning. You know, you decrease by 20%, which we have been successful, but just on that time, that's the time that you pull the part out that you needed. And you're at a location where you cannot get commercial air, and now you're having to, because with the bombers, you have to be very selective about where you're sending them. Larger runways, you're gonna need a large footprint from the standpoint of fuel even. I mean, for the B-1, you're gonna need 185,000 pounds of fuel. That's a lot of, oh, did I just hear somebody with the bomber force? B-1s. So, you know, you're gonna need a lot of items in order to be able to execute appropriately. So as we start to look through what does it look like as we start to make that pivot and have made that pivot, then we're looking at new locations, establishing new locations with site surveys and et cetera, so that the BTF can be effective when we go to those locations. As we all are dealing with, we have to make sure that we're outside of the threat ring. But in order to do that, we've got to think about it just a little bit differently. The final thing I would add is we have used something called BOX, which is the Bomber Onboard Cargo System, in order to exercise that ACE concept of maneuver. So trying to be as self-sufficient as we can, we load as much as we can, and then working to increase the number of box items that we have to go on B-52s when they do go on BTFs.
Yeah, great. Organic lift, some organic lift.
Say again?
Some organic lift
Absolutely.
that you are, yeah,
Absolutely.
okay, getting after. So we kind of touched on it already, but for the future fight, we know we've got to be lighter and leaner, and that's not just equipment or supplies or kits. As you mentioned, it's also brings forward the requirement for MCA, and there's been a lot of discussion, and I know the chiefs there's probably some in the audience are struggling that with mightily because they're the first line of defense for what is MCA. So have we overcomplicated the MCA expectation, and what do you see within your command that's being exercised, that's being trained to, that's working? And so, can y'all just start with you?
Sure. So MCA, have we overcomplicated it? I think that we really need to see it. We want to have people who have the capability to go in a leaner footprint. But we need to make sure that we're not doing marriages of convenience, but we are converging light career fields in order to be able to make ourselves more effective when we move out. So some of the things that we're doing is we are looking at, okay, what makes sense to be able to move and transition one AFSC into another so that they have multiple capabilities. Take the munitions career field, for instance. One of the things that we're looking at in certain areas as kind of a trial is to see if we can look at an airman who is able to build up bombs, deliver bombs, but also do trailer maintenance. And can you have all of those capabilities or a portion of those capabilities and then keep track of it appropriately? And I know this will make some people cringe, but even looking at after you now have built the bomb, could you actually go and load something? Whoa, I know. Like cats and dogs playing in the streets with each other. But we have to think about things differently. And so for any of the CFMs out there, we haven't moved out on that just yet. So you know, it's all good. But from that standpoint, and then we're also having smaller exercises. So we have an exercise that's coming up in July with one of our wings, and they will move out with a similar type concept with some of the things that they've trained at home. Then now they'll take that on the road. Within our LRSs, they're doing very similar things. So that concept is moving out for MCA.
Yeah, great. Jen, what about at ACC?
Sure. So are we overcomplicating it? I think for ACC as a force provider, I think we were getting hung up a lot on what is PACAF going to need? What is USAFE going to need? What is, or UCOM, PACOM? So I do think we were getting caught up in that. And so what we've been talking about and trying to drive to, and I don't know if our Chief Sells is out there somewhere, Chief, is focusing more on a capability than a location. So in my mind, we have overcomplicated a little bit, and I think a good end state would be, let's focus on a capability. So a mission generation MCA, a base operating support MCA. Maybe it's a base recovery after attack MCA. So focus on a capability so we can build to a capability. So I do think that is going to at least help us go, okay, because there's a lot of units that aren't attached to a mission generation force element. So how are they supposed to train? So think like a Nellis or something where they have in-place mission. So we have to start building to a capability versus where do we think our iron is going to go and what is that AOR going to need? And that starts to get too hard. The second thing I'd say, just to piggyback off Kenyon just real quick, is that there's a lot, if we want to keep it simple and people go, where do we start? Start in your own backyard. There's a lot of capability, and the LRS is a great example. Our LRS out at Nellis, and I don't know if there's any of those great airmen out there, but did this. They're doing MCA within the LRS. Like you realize, and even within maintenance, there's things that we don't do within our own community. So before we start, taking the dental hygienist, and making them a bomb loader, let's start with making the ammo troop a bomb loader, or the TMO person a forklift driver, right? Like, let's start within our own communities because we have more control over that.
Yeah, great, thanks.
I would say it's really similar, so blended to my friends up here. What I would offer is we started with those mission generation elements, those UTCs. Who was on those? And then what capability do we need to build to have on that UTC, regardless of location that they go to? So, for example, if you have an age troop and a vehicle mechanic on there, there's some similarities there. And what can we do to just have one based on the amount of capability that may be needed going forward? So, very much a blended approach. But we started with to allow the units to get after it. We asked them to look at that at their own organizations first. Where they needed help from the staff, then we weighed in. We gave them recommendations on where you would build capability amongst AFSCs. They took that to heart and then stepped out. And then again, as we looked at that, we found some synergies, and then we focused more on, regardless of where you go, what kind of grounded capability do you have to have? And that led to some of the base defense, self-aid, buddy care, a much more robust, almost like combat lifesaver skills type trainings that we've offered up at some of our wings so that the kids are ready to go whenever.
Awesome. Okay, and then I'm going to ask you each to kind of comment on this. We were fortunate enough to have the Vice Chief here with us today, and everybody knows his passion for innovation and how he's driving that into our Air Force culture. Undoubtedly, in any of this scenario, with what your MAJCOMs are asked to do, innovation is going to be paramount. So can you share with us perhaps examples of innovation that's being incorporated into the flight line, into warehouses, back shops across your command? And maybe, Dave, you could start for us.
Very fortunate to be an AMC where innovation has really been inculcated into our way of life. It's a big word for a Georgian. I just want to get credit for that. But it varies. So we've got a lot of innovation going on right now in our ports. Some of it's equipment, things like spotty bars, very simple things that help bridge the gaps between 747 loads and K loaders and stuff that people wouldn't think about, but has actually cut down on our safety accidents as well as improved velocity of cargo movement. So there's equipment items. I think really where we're driving to is a lot of our TTPs. So we talked about earlier, you have to be careful with the classification, but our tankers will probably go a lot more forward than people realize. And so it may not be like grandiose or some kind of neat little thing, but doing the hardcore analysis to determine what needs to be on that plane in case it has to divert somewhere that it wasn't expected to help sustain that aircraft. I mean, those are things. The schoolhouses that are standing up to train our folks. We're doing some forward air refueling point innovations. And the boss was, he just identified that will be a program, if you will, for AMC on Tuesday. So we're now going to start working toward that. Everything is driven, though, to how do I maximize that mission generation capability, and then how do I sustain that going forward. And then Mobility Guardian has everything from airplane adjustments when it comes to comm suites to where we want to test things as simple, if you will, as how are we going to use Blade in a C2 type capacity, to experimentation on how to use a drone, which we're really excited about, that actually has a LiDAR and laser type capability on it that we think has big benefits to help us on the aircraft battle damage assessment side. So we just had a test last week, and so we're excited about where that's going.
Yeah,
Thank you.
awesome. Thanks. Jen?
Sure. So lots of innovation inculcated in ACC.
Inculcated, yeah, big word.
Is what you said, in Air Combat Command as well. If I had to think, probably the biggest thing along the theme of aircraft availability, I believe across the Air Force, we're seeing more and more of our wings and maintenance groups standing up wing tactics, maintenance tactics office to lock arms with our ops counterparts in their traditional ops. And we're seeing a lot of really positive things yield from that as we talk about how do we execute the flying hour program, how do we get after training our pilots, and then also bringing in maintenance equity. So we're seeing a lot of things yield from that. So I think the Vice Chief today talked about AWACS, so I can a little shout out to the team at Tinker using maintenance TTPs, theory of constraints. Just they really have only a fleet of 31 aircraft. The Vice Chief mentioned today. It's one of those platforms that we're sustaining, divesting, and operating aggressively all at the same time. They've been able to do some really creative things like non-engine running crew changes to enable a second or third go on the same aircraft, which traditionally we've only done on fighters. They've also done things called ground sorties, right, where the aircraft doesn't actually fly, but you're able to bring the back end crew in to get training and accomplish some of their requirements. So seeing a lot of creative things like that. I could go on. I was just at Beale last week, same thing. Really tightening up their processes and how they execute their flying hour program, able to increase flying more sorties there than they ever have in the past. And the same for off-it too. So especially in our, if you see a theme here in our low density, high demand, where every aircraft matters, a lot of innovation going into optimizing aircraft availability because we need it. We need every aircraft we can get.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, absolutely. So innovation throughout the command, particularly within the A4, we're pushing really hard. We have the benefit of having someone who is steeped in art of the possible, who is helping us drive some of that through the command. And what's really amazing is that our units are gravitating toward the person in the office that we have doing that. And it's manifesting itself through various unique and specific items. But theory of constraints first as a whole is really the way we're helping doing that. I alluded to Operation Trailblazer earlier. We have married up the ability to use CBM Plus with looking at the phase flow and theory of constraints to try to improve aircraft availability. Picking 2 platforms across each of our weapon systems except for the E4 and trying to drive that in. So that concept is moving forward. The other kind of unique things that we're doing with the B-52s at Minot, where it gets a little cold up at Minot, and trying to start an engine during a generation is really, really tough. And so you end up having to try to thaw the engine out before you can start the engine. So we needed an engine cover. And so an innovative thought was to, okay, what kind of engine cover can we utilize to then run the hose up through it from the heater? And so now we're on the 3rd iteration, at trial and error, fail fast, and we're on the 3rd iteration working with a company. And I was recently at Minot, and they showed me the next iteration of it, and it actually looks pretty sporty. kind of space-like, to be able to cover up the dual combined engines that are there, run one hose up, and then now you don't have to sit and wait for you to be able to start the engine. Small things like so airmen were going around and they got very creative on how you take the screws out of X component and then have their own little handmade board in which they were sliding items into and making sure that they had the tool accountability. But this little piece of board, had duct tape all over it. And I mean, it looked like it should have been back in, in Sanford and Son, for sure. Well, we put out a bid and have now a bona fide rubberish-like but rigid ability for them to be able to take their items out, put it there, and it captures it, it holds it tight, and you go away with it. And it's tool accountability, it's everything that you would want it to be. The mindset is really the biggest thing. Making sure that airmen understand that their thoughts, their unique thoughts, will be heard and will act upon them. And so we're tracking that. We're now sending a newsletter out every quarter, basically challenging people, telling them what these great ideas are that are happening. And if you are in Global Strike Command, if you haven't heard about it, come talk to me. But we're challenging them, hey, if you got a great idea, then let's hear about it. And then now let's push it forward. Yeah.
So we have a few minutes left, and we're going to go to the audience for questions. But before we do, somewhere around the year 2000, all of us would have been captains. And just wondering, if you could go back to the 2000 Captain Bell, Captain Hammerstedt, Captain Sanford, what would you tell that young captain that you know now that you didn't know then?
I'll go first, all right. Make sure that you take pictures of the waves that you had in your head then, because they won't last forever.
I thought you were going to say take pictures of your team and the people you served with. But we got it. Okay.
No, seriously. So I would say be bold. I've had this concept where if your boss comes to you with a job and it seems a little far-fetched for you, and it kind of makes you nervous, and your first thought is to coil back, and you think, no, that's not for me, makes your hands a little bit sweaty, you need to take it. Go for it. Because at that point, as CGOs, especially younger CGOs, you have the flexibility, and nobody wants to see you fail. Everybody wants to help you succeed, so you're going to get as much help as you ask for and as much help as you need. So go for it. Be bold about what it is that you're doing. And I think the other one that I would mention is at events like this, there's a concept that somebody told me, I'll have to steal it and plagiarize it, best form of flattery. Your network equals your net worth. So as you move around and you're meeting new people, keep that Rolodex. Keep your favorites, keep them in your iPhone, whatever it might be. Because at some point you're going to come back around and you may be able to connect someone or utilize somebody else's resource. So make good connections and keep them as you move through.
Yeah. Great. Jen?
Probably along the same lines. I think when I think about 2000, where I was in 2000, I think when you're out in the flight line and you feel like you're like alone and unafraid, and quite frankly, the world revolves around you, right? And I think having spent the last 10 years of my career, minus some time at the Pentagon in Air Force Material Command, I think you learn later that we're all in this together, and there is a ginormous enterprise that supports that aircraft or that thing going operational. So I think, again, in venues like this or in environments where you can learn about what other people do, what other people bring to the fight, I wish I understood that better then. What the program offices do, what we'll have General Morris up here, what happens in LCMC, what do they do in AFMC, how much impact the supply chain ops and management wings have on our operations. And I wish that I had friends in those organizations when I was feeling like you're alone and unafraid, right? There's a big team out there, it's a huge enterprise, and so learn as much as you can about what other people are doing around you. That would be what I would say.
Yeah, I would echo that piece. As a captain, you feel very stovepiped. And so I would encourage folks to, well, whether you're a captain, major, lieutenant colonel, or colonel, to reach out and understand what your ops counterparts are doing. Logisticians should learn how to speak ops, and hopefully ops, we can teach them how to speak logistics. But I think there was an opportunity there that I missed. And I think part of that piece, because you gain instant credibility too, if you can talk in that kind of venue. And so I think understanding doctrine, Jen mentioned 1.0, I would add the joint pub 4.0 for us as well, but also I'd skim 3, just so that you understand that. I know it seems kind of nerdy and geeky, believe me. Joint pub 4.0 went from 500 pages to about 178 now, so it's manageable. But I would understand that, or at least skim them and have that piece. I think that would have been helpful, especially on my first deployment, where I was thrust in a joint environment. And it was a learning experience, and it's not a good place to learn. So understanding what my peers do, and then understanding that I'm part of a bigger machine. So I'm not just in back then, a supply squadron or a trans squadron or a maintenance squadron. I'm part of a wing, so the goal is everything I should work towards should be to improve the wing. And it's not about me, it's about the wing's mission. And so I think those are pieces that would have helped me.
Thanks, Dave. All right, and I think it's a little hard for me to see, but I think we have somebody that's got questions, moderating questions.
Sorry, so we do have a lot of questions here. We'll try and get through as many as we can. So fully exercising contested logistics and ACR risk execution of the flying program, which hurts readiness and drives undesired behaviors at the lowest levels to catch back up. How can we do both?
I could not hear it.
It didn't come in
I'm not sure I heard.
clearly.
Essentially, how can we exercise for contested logistics and execute the flying program at the same time?
Well, I would offer that you already do. So contested logistics is, it's not just kinetics. It's any disruption to the supply chain, and so you're working through that on a day-to-day basis while you try to exercise the flying hour schedule and meet the contract that you've made with your wing. So you're working through that. I got it. When you go forward, pick an AOR where it may be more challenging or there may be missiles flying. I got it. That's more disruptive, but that's where you've got to understand what your TTPs are. I think General Bell mentioned every time you come back from an exercise, because sometimes the wings will wonder, hey, what can I do? I mean, every time you come back from an exercise, you ought to be adjusting your readiness spares packages based on what you learned, so you can have the right capability for it, and then you're going to have to be able to be prepared to operate for it. I'll admit, one of the things I didn't mention from an innovation piece at AMC, we're calling it small unit tactics. So how do those small 2-4 ships, how do they operate forward? Is the flying crew chief the one who's going to make the decision as the senior maintainer? Believe me, a lot of antibodies in our command on that, but that's the discussions we need to have. And so I think you can exercise those when you go through any type of flag or any type of experimentation exercise. And that's, again, being parochial, but that's what we hope to learn on Mobility Guardian 23 as we go forward. I hope that helps.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. So as you've discussed, each of the MAJCOMs have readiness initiatives. How are those being integrated, and then how are you sharing those across each of the MAJCOMs?
I could speak for ACC. I mean, we are, and hopefully everyone in the audience agrees if you're part of the command, but I feel like we're very communicative. I feel like the communications are relatively flat in the command. There's a lot of dialogues where we share what's going on between the wings. Every month the COMAC reviews, the flying hour execution, and there's everything from tactical to strategic. Really, there's a lot of good communication. Within the 4, we've restarted some things on touch points with our group commanders, again, which is pretty tactical, but the intent there is to really try to flatten the communications between our wings to share those best practices and let people know what others are doing, because we need to learn fast. So if someone's doing something that's working well, we need to pick that up and go. So From my vantage point, I feel like that's going well in terms of keeping the communication open, so it's real time. But I also understand that reality at the tactical level may be slightly different depending on where you sit.
I'll chime in on that. So we also have touch points across the groups within the command, but in addition to that, we are sharing that data, and particularly with the supply chain management wing. So when you start to think about a lot of the readiness issues, spares and availability becomes an issue when you're trying to get aircraft availability up. So we talk frequently, and we have specific deep dives with the supply chain management wing to help increase aircraft availability. To the portion of the question of how do we share that across MAJCOMs, there is a standard link up that occurs that linked up and run by half A4L to link up all the MAJCOM A4s, and therefore we talk about those issues on a frequent basis, so the sharing does occur.
Yeah, and a lot of that doesn't just come up at the MAJCOM A4 level. The Airmen for Life initiative is a great one. I think that came out of USAFE, correct? Somebody can correct me. But that grew legs. It definitely had a lot of interest across the MAJCOMs, and so much so with the help of the half A4, able to say, hey, let's start piloting that across different MAJCOMs, and that's something that obviously came out of the field.
Great, thank you. And I'm getting the signal that we are out of time for questions, so back to you, ma'am, to close out.
All right, great. So I want to thank my panel members. They didn't have any idea that I was not going to use their official Air Force bio for introductions, and they were great sports about we're all here for the rest of the afternoon, this evening, so looking forward to speaking to a lot of you individually if you have other questions. And thanks again to the team for allowing us to do this panel. Thank you.